Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back in. We'll get started on the second panel. After this panel, there'll be another break and there'll be snacks. So thanks for coming back. This one, we really want to dig into the nuts and bolts of how the primaries work from the perspective of election administrators, which from our perspective is the most interesting one. I'm very pleased to be joined by Chris McGinn, who's the director of the Texas Association of Clerks and Election Officials, county election officials, clerks and election, county election officials, thanks. TA CEO, Kristin Miles from Bastrop County, and Bridgette Escobedo from Williamson County, all of whom have a lot to share, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
I appreciate that, David. Thank you. So as we said, we heard from the academics, and we talked a lot about the state legislatures and the law, and now you get to talk and meet the people that actually have to deal with the voters, and I think their primary target and their primary job is worrying about the welfare of the voters in their local counties. So I'm just going to start off and have these guys introduce themselves, talk a little bit about how long they've been in their position, a little bit of what their position entails.
Good afternoon. My name is Bridgette Escobedo. I am the elections administrator in Williamson County. I started my career in Bastrop County. I was the elections administrator there. In the fall of 2019, I moved to Travis County, where I was the director of elections under the county clerk for about 4 years until I accepted the position in Williamson County to become the elections administrator in 2024. So altogether, 19 years combined experience.
Good afternoon. I'm Kristin Miles. I'm current Bastrop County Elections Administrator and have worked in Bastrop County for 17 years. Actually worked with Bridgette for the first 10 years of my career, and after she left, was appointed Elections Administrator in September of 2019.
If you notice, Kristin had to look at her notes to remind her of her name, because that's how crazy elections in Texas get. So both of these guys are election administrators, as they alluded to, and most of you guys know, Texas elections is split, right? There's about 132 counties that have election administrators, another 122 counties that elections is essentially run by county clerks. So I'm going to get these guys to kind of talk about the differences. Bridgette had some experience, obviously, in a clerk's office, and Kristin being an election administrator. Talk about the differences in how those positions are structured within their county, kind of who they're answered to, you know, what the challenges are in each of those different positions there.
So as an elections administrator, we are appointed by the county clerk, tax assessor, county judge, and both political party chairs locally. So county election commission hires and fires the elections administrator, but we don't really have a lot of direct oversight, although we do work very closely with the individuals who appoint us.
In Travis County, I was, again, under the director of elections under the county clerk's office, and so our office only handled the elections portion of the operation. The voter registration operation fell under the tax assessor collector, so we had a bifurcated system. And it was very interesting working under an elected official, because at the end of the day, the elected official does what the elected official wants to do. I was very fortunate to work under Dana DeBevois. She was the county clerk when I was there, and we had a fantastic relationship, and she had all the experience in the world to know how to navigate through some really trying times, COVID being one of them. And so she was very creative in handling that situation in our operations. Great.
So as we've already talked about a little bit, this year has been very different in Texas elections, whether it be the mid-year redistricting. That puts a lot of pressure on the elected officials to get primaries positioned in the proper place. Bridgette was significantly impacted by redistricting in her county, Kristin a little bit less, but why don't each of you go through kind of your process from November on, from this past November, in setting up and going through the process of how you actually structured and started rolling out the next election?
So I would say, generally speaking...
day by day, every day.
We'd be here a long time. Generally speaking, primary preparations probably start summer or early fall, depending on county size. For Bastrop County, we began contract negotiations about September. Last year was slightly different because part of the early on steps that we take are precinct chair filings. So there was mid-census redistricting, which changed congressional lines, which then in turn changes voting precinct lines. precinct chairs candidates began filing earlier, so there were a lot of questions from precinct chairs who were like, well, what is my new precinct? And a whole lot of wait and see. So we survived the November election and then immediately, generally speaking, transitioned to primary prep. Last year, there was a lot of hurry up and wait and see on congressional redistricting before we could really start ballot preparations, finalizing candidate filing. Have I missed anything else?
Generally, we run about 6 months prior to an election, and so, as Kristin mentioned, we had that redistricting, which created a lot of work, a lot of hurdles on the back end, and in Williamson County, the majority of the county was redistricted, and so we worked really quickly to get that information into the system so that people could file appropriately and know kind of where they were supposed to, get filed and where they were going to vote in their precincts, and so the staff had a lot of, hours worked, a lot of long nights. We worked really diligently, and then we had a system, the statewide system, because we are an online county, that didn't meet our needs, is probably a good way to say that, as expected.
So with that, get into the weeds a little bit. Like, what's it, not with team, what's it take to redistrict? Like, what's it actually take? So say after the November election, you had to wait, right, because you had to run the November election. What does it actually take in your office to change all the streets to get them aligned correctly? Because I don't think people understand what it actually takes to, it's not just a button that says you go from 23 to 3. What's it take?
I'd say the first step is Commissioner's Court action, which they have to redraw voting precinct lines to comply with new congressional lines. For smaller counties and larger counties, it probably is slightly different on how much of that work is done internally in the elections office and how much the prep work for Commissioner's Court is done with maybe GIS assistance. We're very lucky in Bastrop County and have a very good relationship with GIS, so they help navigate what those new precincts should look like based on new congressional lines. But the first step is Commissioner's Court approving new maps, which can be very confusing when it's done before a November election. So your voting precinct is changing, but not until after we conduct the current election. And then practically speaking, in an elections office, in our current voter registration system, it's often touching every single voter that's impacted by the change.
And I'll reiterate that, sometimes touching them twice or 3 times. And then we were unexpectedly hit with some different lawsuits, which caused us to come to a screeching halt. And so Kristin mentioned before, it was a very much hurry up and get this thing done and now wait and sit on it. And a lot of people were wanting information from our office that we didn't feel comfortable because of the pending lawsuits move forward. And so I know specifically in Williamson County, our issue was the distribution of our mass mail out, our voter registration cards. And so we had quickly moved to redistrict so that we could have a certain timeline so we could get those cards in the mail ahead of the primary election. And so we did everything that we could on our end. However, we were met with some inefficiencies in the system, and we were not able to get those cards out, which contributed to some of the complications we had in the primary election.
So recently they passed a new 45-day deadline, right, for logic and accuracy testing. And with our early primary, as I spoke upon, that fell somewhere around the first week of January. Talk about how that added to a little bit of that pressure to organize and get the primary processed in the time frame that was allotted between redistricting in early December, holiday break, New Year's, and then get rolling.
I'll just start with Bastrop County didn't meet the deadline to have LNA testing 45 days before Election Day due to redistricting, and ballot preparation just wasn't ready, which is very difficult because I pride myself in always meeting statutory deadlines. That was just a very difficult email to write, being the first time that we had to meet a 45-day deadline. It was super complicated.
There was a break.
There was
a break. There was a break in We did not take a break in Williamson County. We rolled right through the holiday, the Christmas break. We didn't have one, and that was really challenging for the staff. We worked right through because we knew we had certain deadlines to meet. What people don't know in a primary election is we rely heavily on the party chairs. It's their election. They must come in and review their ballot and their candidates. And there were some challenges within the team system for our party chairs to get the official list of candidates going. And so while we were asking them to come in and certify their ballot in a candidate order, they weren't able to do so. So every day that we weren't able to meet that marker pushed back our LNA, and we were we program, and that's the difference between different counties. They have different operational functions, and so I know Kristin does not program her own elections. She relies on the vendor. However, Williamson County does. We have a ballot programmer in-house, and so we were able to move a little bit more quickly, and we did meet the deadline, but it was by the skin of our nose.
So as you guys said, and it's been talked about before, Texas is one of the only states that gives as much control to the party chairs to influence how the primary is being run. Both these two had very different experiences with that. So Kristin talked about the normal process, the joint election agreement that typically happens, and then Bridgette, you could talk about a little bit of your experience, and again, where the timeline flows in with those party chairs and that negotiation.
So again, like I mentioned, we began primary preparations probably around September of the year prior. Bastrop County does currently operate under the countywide polling place program and joint primary elections. However, that wasn't always the case. 10 years ago, we were separate primaries, separate polling locations. The transition, I think, to countywide has helped facilitate voter confusion. So my goal was to keep polling locations consistent for the voter. But the control or decision isn't solely up to the elections administrator. It is up to the party chairs. Right? Yeah, I don't know how else to say that. I mean, it does make things difficult because while our goal as elections administrators is to keep things consistent, if our party chairs wish for them to look differently, then we have to work with party chairs to do what they would like done during their primary election.
Before we get to Bridgette, because that could be a lot, that relationship that you have with your party chairs, and your party chairs this year agreed to have a joint election, was there any discussion to split? Is that a relationship that you've had that was set up, that they want to run a joint election and it wasn't even a discussion?
Yeah, I would say our current party chairs, there was not much of a discussion other than here's your contract for a joint election agreement.
Fantastic.
They very much do not want to run primary elections.
Now, Bridgette, you had a very different experience.
Well, you might have heard.
Yeah, I may have heard. Talk a little bit about not only the actual process of it, but that relationship with the party chairs, the relationship you've had in the past, how the relationship may or may have changed, but how it went back even during the runoff to kind of the way it was. And talk a little bit about your experience administratively, right? Doesn't have to get into the weeds and stuff.
So party chairs, you may have a new party chair every 2 years. And so I signed my contract with my Democratic Party chair in June. She knew exactly what she wanted. And so we were able to move forward with the standard contract, and it was business as usual. And then we did get a new party chair on the Republican side, and so that changed things a little bit as far as the expectations and as far as the contract went. We do understand as elections administrators that primary elections are the responsibility, of the party, and we do want to facilitate. I proposed a joint primary, and I got, that's never going to happen. And I'm like, okay, well, what can we do to, make this? We're always advocating for the voters, and our first challenge was what can we do to make it easier on the voters, and so we had a separate contract, and I think the expectations were different with each party as far as what they wanted to. We generally, like I said, run 6 months in advance, and so we are, event planners. We plan this event, and we've got to have all of these things in place. And so the goalpost constantly moving, the expectations constantly changing. We're difficult to plan for the primary election.
When did you finally sign that contract with the Republican Party chair? Do you remember the date,
minute,
yes.
It was the first week in December, and it was after a letter that I had sent after Thanksgiving holiday, and said if we're not in contract, you're on your own. And I would love to see for the lawmakers in the room, policymakers, that a solid deadline, because like I said, we do, as election administrators, we want to do everything we can. It's their election. We want to make sure they have the election that they want to have. However, we do get to pass a deadline where it's not feasible and it's not practicable. And I did send a letter to the party and said, if we go any further past this date, I'm not going to be able to help you. I just knew that there was going to be a scenario that put us, at a significant disadvantage to give them the primary that they wanted and the primary that the voters deserved.
So Dallas County went through a similar process as you guys paid attention to. And if you're not aware, basically the way current law is written, that if one party, they both use the countywide polling location program, if one party does not want to use that, then the other party has to essentially concur. So in Bridgette's case, the Republicans wanted to go back to precinct-based, which then led the Democrats, who had already signed a contract, as she mentioned, back in June, to then have to kind of figure out precinct-based voting for those voters, right? So that inconsistency there not only leads to a lot of voter confusion, but obviously a lot of administrative burdens that are kind of placed on these two. So you got through that question. Now we'll move on to the primary a little bit, or the runoff here. So obviously there's a 50% threshold for the runoff. How does administering a potential runoff affect your planning, affect your budget? And do you just bake that in now because you assume that there's always going to be a runoff?
Yeah, we plan as if there is going to be a runoff election. So we always just assume, and that way we'll have our preparations in place, and then we're very thankful if that doesn't happen.
I would say the one thing to note, though, May elections, for those of us who contract with local political subdivisions, primary runoffs occurring near the same time as those elections, not only is administratively difficult for an elections administrator, it's extremely confusing for the voter. And there are a lot of voters who show up to vote in a city and school election who really think they're there to vote for a primary runoff, and vice versa.
So talk a little bit about that timeline, because you guys were doing contracts with local entities during the time early voting had started, right? Talk from February on, when you were running a local election. That was what, May the 2nd? Then you had a runoff May 24th, or all those things.
You think we sent contracts in February?
No, I don't know when you sent contracts. That's why you're the experts.
We sent contracts
I'm just
to
here.
local jurisdictions probably in the middle of redistricting and
Before the Christmas holiday.
planning for, yeah, absolutely. But LNA deadline, definitely, while we're trying to run a primary election, we're often prepping for those May city school elections, conducting logic and accuracy testing, running early voting then while we're trying to LNA for a primary runoff. So there are a lot of things that we do that do overlap. It's extremely difficult for any elections administrator, but especially for small and mid-sized counties who have limited staff.
I would say the same. We have to keep all the balls in the air. And so for us, to give you kind of some context to that, the day after Election Day, we had entity proofing for our May city and school elections, so it was no sleep.
And how many staff do you have in your office, Chris?
Myself and 4 full-time employees.
Bridget?
I have 20 employees.
20 employees for how many registered voters?
About 500,000.
500,000 registered voters, right. So for all the legislators in here, big raises to all the election administrators in here, right? So with that staffing resource constraints in the face of public, what I mean, you just kind of got into it a little bit, but what else are they not aware of, or what remedies do you think can come about to try to fix, especially in those primary year elections with city and school elections and everything else going on? Are there any challenges that you think can immediately be fixed? If not, no.
I don't have a resolution, but I would say, generally speaking, aside from staffing shortages, is space constraints for mid-sized counties, probably even for larger counties, but definitely for the smaller ones, is oftentimes we're having to run early voting in the same room that we would generally conduct logic and accuracy testing, so space is our largest hurdle.
I would have to say that as well. There are so many different things that have been introduced recently, like the post-election hand count audit. We are in a county of over 100,000, so we must live stream all of our activities. And so finding a place where it's big enough to accommodate an expanded ballot board and it's live streamed is very difficult. So we experienced that, and we had to get our Republicans to go across town to do their hand count in another building, and facilitating that was very difficult. So it's just logistically impossible sometimes.
And we kind of skipped over a little bit, but when the runoff came about after March, did you guys have to sign new election agreements with your parties to run the runoff?
Ours does not. It is an
Okay.
extension. So.
Okay.
And so after the primary election that Williamson County had, I was contacted by the Republican Party chair who immediately wanted to renegotiate our contract because the contract does cover both the primary and primary runoff. And I welcomed that phone call because it was very apparent that we needed to go back to the drawing board. What we did in the primary election didn't work. A lot of people were disenfranchised. There was mass confusion on both sides. And so I was very happy to receive that message from her saying that she wanted to renegotiate that contract. And so in contrast, for those of you that may not know, we were able to negotiate complete, I don't want to say control, but operational control over the primary runoff election. We handled it, and as there was no issues. It was ran very smoothly. It was business as usual in Williamson County.
So during the primary, again, just to reiterate, during the primary, the Republicans and the Democrats had to use precinct-based voting. During the runoff, you went back to your countywide voting that had been used. Typical polling places.
Yes.
Went smoothly.
Yes. Yes.
Subject matter experts, you knew what
Yes.
you were doing.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Good. All right, we'll move a little bit to poll worker participation, voter participation, that type of stuff. So I think Texas has over 6,000 polling places that they open during a typical election cycle. Talk a little bit about kind of recruiting, retaining poll workers in a primary year. You just spoke about the 3 elections within 3 months, and in some cases 4 elections. You just had another election, didn't you, Bridgette? Talk about how difficult that is, not only for staffing your place, but your workers, poll worker recruitment, all those different things. Talk about how many precincts and polling places you talked about, and then your difficult nature, or not difficult.
I'll speak on, our typical age of our election worker is about 70 years old, sometimes higher. And it is difficult to recruit them and keep them engaged. And so, as Chris mentioned, we've had back-to-back elections pretty much since January. And so, voter fatigue, you hear about that often. Well, poll worker fatigue is very real. And especially what the county went through during the primary election, it was very difficult. People, sent me messages saying, "I never want to do that again. I don't want to be a part of that." It was very difficult. They are on the front lines, and so while the office was overrun with complaints and people upset, imagine being in the polling location in front, voters who had been to several different polling locations throughout the day, being told, "Hey, you're not in the right place again," and so they experienced that was real. And thankfully, we sent them an email and said, we acknowledge the problems of the primary election, and I think that was difficult for us to send, but we acknowledged, and we didn't have that much power, and to avoid that situation. Again, it's the party's election, and what the general public doesn't understand is that we are just the facilitator. We are not the person that did that, because a lot of people reached out and said, "Why did you do this? What made you make this decision?" And it wasn't a decision that I made. So we were able, thankfully, to recruit and retain and convince them to come back, a lot of our poll workers. And we said, "Listen, we're in the primary runoff. We're back to countywide. We're back to working together." We have a lot of teams, individuals who don't like to affiliate with a party. They have a team that they work with. They're great. They work together. Republicans and Democrats come to the table. They check in voters. They handle all of the different situations nicely. And so they just wanted to be back together in the same location to support each other. So we were really thankful in that.
Yeah, the only thing I think I was going to add is just the extended time that polling locations are open. Particularly, primary elections require 12-hour voting days the entire last week of the voting period. Even in a county that is business as usual and voting looks the same, it is challenging to find election workers who want to work 60-plus hours in a week. We've tried splitting shifts because that seems like the obvious answer. If people don't want to work 60 hours, then just split their shift. But nobody wants to take responsibility for a polling location and not be there all day. That is probably our single most difficult thing to navigate, is extension of voting hours, which is needed so that voters have time to vote, and finding adequate staff to cover those polling locations during that time.
So historically, turnout, obviously, it was higher this year, but it's historically low during a primary. Talk about a little bit of the biggest structural reasons that you think that occurs, and kind of the burdens you have to run an election as if it's going to be 100% turnout. So does that really impact your office at all from the low turnout standpoint?
I would say the turnout does not impact planning for an election. Obviously, we plan for high turnout elections and hope that we have high turnout elections and oftentimes don't in primaries. In my opinion, probably timing is the largest thing. Voters are not super engaged early in the year. There's not as much media coverage. And most of our voters who are voting in primary elections tend to be politically motivated.
And I would say the opposite of that too is that people don't want to affiliate with the party. Maybe they are a candidate, they're advocating on behalf of one candidate, but typically they don't want to affiliate. And so we get a lot of phone calls in the middle of a primary election where people will say, well, they made me say my party. You know, I had to go to a separate check-in line. And those are the things that are required in a primary election. And they just don't want that to be public information, although we all know it is. They don't want to affiliate.
Which is a perfect transition. So as was already talked about, there's been discussion about closed primary, not from the political side of things, but it was already touched on. What's the practical, what would you have to do in your office to run a closed primary, depending on the guidelines from the state or the legislature? Would it be feasible or would it be possible?
Contact 63,000 registered voters
right.
and have them re-register.
Let's get going. Here we go.
I think logistically, when you break down the number of registered voters that we have versus the number of employees, each one of my employees is responsible for about 25,000 registered voters. When you break it down like that, I think it would be very, very difficult for us to go back and re-register, given the system that we have right now. And even if the system was, to be tomorrow working perfectly, I think it would be incredibly difficult for us to re-register everybody.
Which all that leads to voter confusion, right? So in primaries, it's new, but the cycle spikes. What factors make one county's primary feel smoother or less chaotic than another? And how important is it that there's consistency in the process for voters and for yourselves and for your staff and for your poll workers?
I think, it comes down honestly to the party chairs. I think if you have two party chairs that want the best for the county and want the best for the voters, operationally it becomes obviously, easier to manage. I think if you have two party chairs that are on opposite ends of, their beliefs and what is right or what's best or what we can and cannot do, I think there is a lot of negotiations. I know we spent that good part of December having conversations when we should have spent the good part of December planning.
Kristin, nothing to add? You don't really have anything to add there? All right. Outreach efforts and education efforts. First, what is your kind of philosophy as an EA to your responsibility to either educate the public, and then what efforts do you guys make within your county, and how much extra money do you get for educating the voters of your counties?
$0 for voter education. I would say our biggest resource in Bastrop County is our website. We try really hard to make sure that the voters understand when to vote, where to vote, and the process for voting. But we rely heavily on candidates for voter outreach efforts because voters are motivated by candidates, not necessarily election officials.
I would agree with that. I am in Williamson County very, very fortunate to have a very amazing League of Women Voters chapter in Williamson County. They're right here. So shout out to you guys. Y'all are amazing. We would not have been able to do half of the outreach without them. And it just is a natural, relationship that we have. They're able to do the heavy lifting, so to speak, because our office is not able to do that. We're, head down doing the procedural issues and things we do. And we've often communicated that we'd love to get out in the community and do more voter outreach. However, we're just behind the screens and entering voter registration applications, et cetera. So I'm very thankful that we have our partnership.
Yeah, so the partnerships are important, but with the changes that have taken place, what would you hope to see with the voter education? Would you hope that, as it was implied earlier, the state does more? Would you hope that you had more resources from the state to be able to outreach? Because you guys are going to be the ones answering the questions from the voters, right? Even though you're not the ones changing things or educating them. So what in your ideal world would it be for voter outreach? Is it just the partnerships? Thoughts?
I think it depends on what we are educating on. So if it's a statewide change with consistent change across all counties, then in my opinion, that should come from the state. If it is something more local, then probably less of a state question, but we need more county resources to be able to do local outreach efforts.
I'd have to agree with that. I think, if the state was able to do more outreach, there was more allocation of funds and resources, I think that would also be helpful. I was very surprised to learn how many people in the community are uneducated on primary elections. And so we created on our website a special tab that was just, primary election and kind of laid out who was responsible for each function, which was helpful. And when people were calling in and asking us why we made this decision or that decision, we would say, here's more information on our website. We listed our actual contract on our website so that the voters themselves, the public, could read what was in the contract, and it laid out very specifically who was responsible for each thing. And there was a lot of people who just weren't knowledgeable around primary elections.
So this wasn't on your list, so don't get mad at me, you two. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit. But it was already talked about, right? The mobility of Texas voters, the different techniques or policies or procedures used across the state. What challenges have you seen? You're a super fast-growing county, suburban to her, right? You're obviously in the midst of people coming in and out. So how did that kind of inconsistent, and I don't mean that in a negative way, impact your education, your voters, your policies? How much time do you spend trying to educate voters on it's different here, even though you just came from Travis or something like that? Either one of y'all too.
I guess I'm just back to what I said originally. We don't spend a lot of time on voter outreach. I mean, we have our website, we do newsletters, so I guess more than some counties do. Most of our education efforts probably come from if a voter contacts our office directly. Like, we obviously dedicate time to answer questions and walk them through the process if they have questions. But with limited resources, it's extremely difficult to get out in the community and do true voter registration or education efforts. And when we have done them, they're not always well attended.
Okay. Shocking.
We relied heavily on social media and on our website. And so we just sat down one day and we blocked off the entire day and we pre-planned all of the messaging when it became very apparent to us that people were not aware of what goes into a primary election or what their role in a primary election was. And so we actually tried to actively engage people and communicate, something we typically don't do on social media, where we don't monitor it all day long and sit there and have these conversations and provide clarity around questions that they have. But we did try to do that more so because it was just such a broad, topic that we needed to discuss. And so it was successful in that regard. And then again, League of Women Voters really does the heavy lifting.
So this is it was towards the end, but we'll put it in its place here. So how much does the primary affect the need for consistency in a primary help you guys out with things that you dealt with? Because I know my mom lives out of state, and as many times as she called me because the national news was not reporting correctly and questioning what was going on. But again, that's got to be difficult for both of you. You had to take questions, Kristin, about what was going on in Williamson County, and you probably took questions of what was going on in Dallas or why I could do this in your bordering county. So how important is consistency in procedures to you guys administering elections and also for the voters to understand?
I think it's really important, the education piece across the state, because there's 254 ways to skin a cat, if you will. And each county does things differently. And so because in Williamson County, we had this primary election where our Democrats were using ballot scanners. They had electronic media, and so we were able to read that media in and report results very quickly. We were not doing that on the Republican side. And so the Republican Party was responsible for all of the intake and all of the ballot seals and security that they had. And so they, in the contract, negotiated that they wanted to be responsible for their own primary. And for those of you that weren't aware, we did not report results until 1 p.m. the following day. So we had about a 32-hour consecutive workday. And so that was really, really difficult to do.
I imagine.
I will say, thinking on what Bridgette's response was earlier, we also engage on social media, but don't have any followers. So maybe the engagement comes from the confusion of not knowing when and where to vote, because we didn't field any more questions in our primary than typical. Generally speaking, our voter engagement is pretty low. Like, our voters don't have a lot of questions, and that probably comes from the polling locations are consistent, no matter if
Yeah.
it's a primary, if it's a city school election, our voters know when and where to go vote.
And to be clear, the reason that we had so much engagement is because people thought they knew what they were going to do. They thought they had been doing primary elections a certain way in Williamson County for a very long time, so they thought they had a plan, only to show up and realize they didn't know. And so that was where a lot of that piece of voter engagement came, because they thought that I'm going to go to this location that I always go to, that's my location, and all of that had changed. So.
Absolutely. I'm sure our voters would have a lot more to say if they didn't, if they showed up and didn't in fact know where to vote.
In fact, no word. So with that leads into some of the election integrity questions. You guys both have two very different experiences with that, and we'll get to that in a second. I think typically, as studies show, that voters think that their counties are doing things fantastic, right? It's the other county that's the problem. Bridgette, unfortunately, did not experience that, which we'll get to a little bit. But again, talk a little bit about that, about how do you respond to constituents that have concerns or raise concerns about the accuracy of stuff. I'm sure you had to field questions of what the heck's going on in Dallas and Williamson, right? And you just had to fend for your life. So we'll get to that in just a second.
Literally.
But yeah, literally. So talk about how those constituents raise concerns. How do you kind of explain the accuracy, the security? Because you can't explain the whole process like you're doing here, because no voter is going to give you an hour, right? So how do you kind of quell those concerns?
So we have added a section on our website about election security to inform the voters. I don't know that they read it, but it is there. So if voters have questions, we can direct them to what Texas elections require for pre- and post-election testing, manual counting following the election.
There are a lot of checks and balances in place. We we are required, because we're a county of over 100,000 people, we are required to have live streaming. So we do have our live streaming. We have our post-election hand count audit. We have reconciliation paperwork that we must put on our website, which is, unofficial and then official. And it gives an explanation if there are any differences between the amount of check-ins in your poll book and the amount of ballots that are actually cast. And so it is very clear and transparent, we believe. And so when I have someone contact me and say, X, Y, Z, or they have concerns, I point to all of those different things. And then if that doesn't work, I ask them to get involved, become part of the process. If you, want to be on our ballot board, if you think that there is fraud in mail voting, please be on our ballot board. It's comprised of bipartisan, people from each party, and they, are able to kind of get a front row seat as to all of the different checks and balances. And every single time that I've invited somebody in that had question in the process, they were like, wow, I didn't know that all of these different things were in place. And so sometimes they're thankful, and sometimes they walk away still skeptical.
So with regard to security protocols for primary specifically, I kind of know what you're going to say, but I'm going to make you say it anyway. What's different for primary elections that you run versus primary elections that Bridgette, that you just had to run with regards to security?
So I would say the required security processes in Texas election code don't differentiate between primary elections versus general. So in my instance, where we're conducting a joint primary election under the countywide polling place program, the security measures look exactly like they do in a November general. I'll let Bridgette speak to that more, but in my mind, the only real difference would be if you're not conducting a joint primary, that all of those things are just duplicated.
In Williamson County, I employ law enforcement officers during my early voting period to go and work, kind of drive around the county, check in our polling locations, make their presence known. And it's really become a great partnership, because they get out in the community and they're able to meet constituents, they're able to meet people in the public and get that, good feeling. Our election workers really like that. They have, they know law enforcement is going to be checking in on them throughout the day. So that's really helpful. And it also helps, to make sure that within our polling locations, everyone knows that they're safe, And with the primary election this year and kind of the events that, preceded it, we increased law enforcement. And so, again, we had 4 that we were going to employ, and we ended up employing 10 and then 20 on election night. And so we really needed that presence, known. But what it did cause us is to go significantly over budget, because we do pay for that, and that comes out of the general fund budget, which is my budget. But I felt like it was a cost, given the circumstances in Williamson County, that was really needed. And so it's something that I will continue to do. I feel like the voters in the community need that. I think they rely on that, unfortunately.
What were some of the pressures that were put on you because it wasn't a joint election agreement with regards to security and integrity? Not that you changed your processes, but what you talked about the law enforcement. What else was increased cost that I don't think people think about when you go to precinct-based or anything like that?
We doubled all of our resources. We needed to hire all of the workers. And so just to be clear, we did not contract to hire our Republican workers. So that was upon the party. We have a certain standard of qualifications that a minimum, I guess, if you will, within our poll workers. And we have, very high, standards that we require that they meet in order to work on behalf of Williamson County and represent us in the polls. We did not have any oversight on the people, on the poll workers that the one party hired. And so we had people that hadn't worked in many, many years who represented them. So you had to go and double all of our polling locations. We had to go double all of our poll workers and resources. And so specifically in Williamson County, in our contract, we made it very clear to both our parties that we did not have enough resources. We did not have enough ballot boxes. We didn't have enough ballot scanners. And so we were really trying to encourage them to do a joint primary just based on the allocation of resources that we had available. Like I said, there was no negotiation in that. And so the Republican Party said, well, we won't need to use ballot scanners. Yeah, we'll give those to the Democrats. The Democrats can use the ballot boxes and scanners, and we'll, do our own thing, basically. And so I had not had that conversation with the Republican Party until on election night, when the ballot boxes were coming back into our location. They were black and yellow totes that you could get from like a Lowe's or from Home Depot. And that was the first time I had seen them. And I was just very concerned about just spacing and how we were going to conduct this. And it was just very eye-opening where we should have had that more communication within the party. They did have a primary administrator, which each party has the ability to hire within their own, which conducts all of their elections. And so they didn't have forms. They didn't have the resources that are needed to run an election. And so the workers within the and the voters, but the workers were very frustrated, I think, with the allocation of resources that they were provided. So it was just all out, pretty much catastrophic for them.
So this wasn't on your list either, but I'm going to ask you both. The nature of running another association's primary, right? You guys are running party primaries, but you guys are signing off on the results. Like, does that make you cringe in certain parts? Like you said, Bridgette, the primary handled a lot of stuff, right? You guys are signing off on the results. Is that comfortable? Do you wish that, again, it was in your hands, that you could secure, because election administrators are known to be control freaks. So how does that affect you, knowing that by law it's out of your control a little bit, right?
So we have partisan ballot boards in Central Count, and so thankfully the Republican Party had a very well-seasoned Central Count board who had been with me very many elections, and so she's very well-versed. We started running the ballots through our ballot scanner, and we noticed very quickly there was no reconciliation paperwork with them. So we had no idea how many ballots were expected to be run through the counter, and that is one. It was kind of, eye-opening. I think we thought that giving the party 100% control over their primary election, that they would have all of these things, kind of their talking points covered. And when we didn't have any paperwork and we didn't have ballot boxes secured and other things, was very eye-opening. So we had to pivot quickly and figure out how we were going to address those things. So it was extremely challenging.
So I would say, generally speaking, whether it's a primary or a general election, yes, elections administrators are control freaks, but we hand over a large portion of our job in every election to presiding and alternate judges and hope that they don't mess it up. That would be, I think, more difficult whenever you are then passing that administrative control to parties. Particularly if the party wanted to hand count, for instance, but the elections administrator is then responsible to.
That's where I was getting at. Neither of you two had to do it, but that's where I was getting at, so continue.
Yes, that could be challenging for an EA. So if the party chooses to hand count ballots, for instance, we still have an obligation under the law to accept those results. And certify is probably the wrong word, but I can't at the moment think of what it is, but we are still attesting to those results being accurate or correct,
But at least-
personally, I would have a difficult time, yes.
But at least they hand count them. You can run them through the scanner and make sure those numbers are correct, right?
Absolutely not.
What do you mean? Tell me why you can't do that. I'm serious.
Texas law does not allow for us to recount results that are
Yeah.
already counted. So no, as an elections administrator, if the party did choose to hand count the ballots, we would not have the authority under current law to recount the results, just to simply accept them as they are presented to us.
That was my point.
And
Roundabout way.
we are in charge of early voting. We are not in charge of election day, and so that control, so to speak, is definitely shared.
All right, you're off the hot seat a little bit now. So, did any of the increased scrutiny on election administration affect, we talked a little bit about poll workers, but you talked about the burden of being a poll worker. Did it affect your recruiting? Did it affect them coming back? You had already mentioned about the scrutiny that was received during the primary. How, in a broader atmosphere, have you seen that change over the course of both your careers? Has it changed as far as how scrutinized elections have become over the past 10 or 15 years, or 20 or 30?
So, as Kristin mentioned before, we were both in Bastrop County together many, many years ago, and a little bit of history here. It used to be a celebration on Election Day, and in Bastrop County they had a kind of a tradition where they would gather at the local newspaper, and we would print out the results, and they would have a runner that would run over there, and they'd have this gigantic whiteboard where they would handwrite, the results, and that all of the candidates were there, both parties were there, the sheriff was there, the judge was there, and they would celebrate, they would congratulate, winners would win, losers would lose, and it was just all in all a good time. And they would have they would have the convention at the polling location, and so everyone was generally happy, and that was a long time ago. And so now, sometimes we can't even be in the same room together, and that's really difficult,
I will say I ruined that tradition whenever Bastrop County started using election night reporting. They were not very pleased that I posted the results online. But to answer your question, I think the largest challenge is probably those higher level positions like presiding judge, alternate judge. Less and less people want to take on the responsibility to serve in those roles.
Okay. Texas, one of the, by law, transparent states in the public having access to stuff. How do you balance the transparency with the need to protect the integrity of what's going on in the processes? Or do you just follow the law and don't worry about the transparency? Or how has that been burdensome to you with regards to transparency? You mentioned everybody you invite in and everything else.
This year, we live stream a good portion of our building and a good portion of our operation. And it wasn't until we experienced threatening phone calls to the staff and to myself, death threats, and people threatening to come down to the office, where it made us, take a different approach. And we had never been challenged with, protecting, the beehive, if you will, and so not really really it changed our perspective in our operations and how we go about doing things. And largely on election night across the state of Texas, your buildings are open. You are open to receive those workers back in and those votes in, and so we had to really kind of be creative in our processes, because protection of our workers and safety was paramount.
So Bastrop County actually does live stream as well, even though we are not legally required to do so. The requirement's only for counties with a population of over 100,000 at the time of the last census, which
You're off the hook.
we're off the hook. But we do offer live streaming. But I think that balance is extremely difficult between what's legally available to the public and where election officials have to follow the law for chain of custody. And oftentimes we're stuck in the middle and sometimes have to make a hard decision.
Okay. Good. All right, last couple questions. If you could make one structural change to Texas primary, what would it be and why? I'll start with you, Kristin, and then I'll go.
Unlimited funding is not a possibility.
No, that's a possibility, absolutely. David's going to write a check, so once you get off stage, it's not a big deal.
Probably not obtainable, but structuring primaries so that elections administrators have more control over how elections are run in their communities, and that they can be more similar to the way that we conduct county elections for generals and others, because ultimately when voter confusion happens, we're the ones who take the questions.
And Bridgette, I know you would love that also, but
Yeah.
what's the other solution? Or what would you, in your experience that you just experienced, what would have been super helpful to at least mitigate some of the issues that you had because the two parties couldn't agree?
I think in general, the election code regarding primary elections hasn't been updated or looked at in a very, very long time. And so that would be kind of the starting point, I think. And more direction, I think more education for the county chairs, I think involved in political parties. I'm not sure they really know. They look at the code every 2 years when they have a primary election, and what they think, this says, is not really what it says. They don't really speak the language. And then finally, I think just firming up some dates, some deadlines, so that we can make sure that we, have that in place.
And we had this conversation, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but in a compromise, the ability for both parties to choose, right? I think
Yeah.
Bridgette mentioned that half her time was spent mitigating personalities, right? Because the Democrats didn't want to give in to what the Republicans wanted. And if the Democrats could have just kind of done, and you could speak to that a little bit if you'd like to, or I would.
Again, we as elections administrators, I think our goal is to be advocates for the voters, number one, and to give the parties the primary election that they wanted and deserved. Okay, that's why they contract with us, and so there was a lot of negotiation on both sides, really trying to accommodate their wishes and their needs and give them the election that party wanted to have, and I think that was important. But also caused a lot of confusion at the same time. And it got to be where, we were changing polling locations the weekend before Election Day because the Democrats were very adamant they didn't want to share polling locations with the Republicans. The Republicans wanted to be in those same locations, and we got ourselves into a situation where, because we were precinct level, as a countywide model, we don't typically do voter counts. We just look at the map and go, okay, this is a great location. It's off a highway. It has all these features. But when you're in a primary level consolidation or combination, there's limits to how many voters you can put in a location. And so that last weekend before Election Day, we were moving locations, and which compounded the confusion, and we got ourselves in a situation where we put, I think, 15 precincts in one location that wasn't able to accommodate the traffic, and we didn't necessarily just kind of in the moment go back and take a step back, and we didn't have the time to go back and reevaluate that, and in hindsight, that was one of the major problems that we had, I think.
All right, kind of lastly, there are some legislators and legislative staff in here. What could you tell them, one or two concrete changes in law regarding, I think we touched on it already, regarding primary or anything else? And then what would you like the policymakers, the public to know? I think you guys have done a fantastic job getting into the complicated nature of what you guys do and where your perspective is, but the last few minutes, market yourself and how great you guys are. Seriously, and you have these folks in front of them, let them know the perspective of an EA, of a clerk, just trying to run elections, and how the partisan nature of the state legislature and the national politics don't come into effect in your individual decisions and job performance.
So I think echoing what Bridgette said, clarity would be helpful. Timelines for contract negotiations is probably the one that's at the top of everyone's mind. And I alluded to this earlier, but additional time between candidate filing and required public logic and accuracy testing, those are challenging. And what Bridgette had said earlier, that as elections officials, we want safe and secure elections, but ultimately we just need the resources to do our job.
The amount of unfunded mandates that we have and recently have to deal with is just unsustainable. I think clear guidelines, more support from the Secretary of State's office, I think the resources, like Kristin said, would be really, really helpful. I think people need to know that elections administrators around the state, we want to do a good job. There are so many new rules that are put into place every single day. We are about to go into another significant change that will drastically change the outlook of elections in Texas with Senate Bill 2753. So we'll need that support and that guidance and clear guidance on how to implement that. I think every election administrator in every office across the state wants to do a good job. There are a lot of protections for poll workers and for, I like to call them enthusiasts. There's a lot of access available to them, and there are very little resources for election officials. Now, we did get some new laws that were implemented that, had us able to suppress our information, but it needs to be expanded. Me personally, my name isn't on the voter registration rolls, but my name is on my appraisal district. My husband's there. It was a real scary thought to know people knew where I lived and could reach me and come to my house. And so for those of you that don't know, I was under police protection for a little bit based on the threats that I endured by social media, the misinformation, the disinformation, people calling the office, threatening me, threatening my staff. I mean, those were very real things. So to look at your staff who are just regular county employees and wanting to do a good job and know that you don't have a lot of protections for them, is very scary. And thankfully, and I was sharing this with Llano County EA, I have a very good working relationship with law enforcement in Williamson County, and the sheriff there came in and did an amazing job for not only the staff, but for myself as well. But there definitely needs more protection for election officials, yeah, that's what we need.
Good deal. So obviously you guys can scan to ask questions. Again, I'll just kind of put a cherry on the top. No matter where I've gone across the country, I think David could preach to this. Anybody that's gone out knows that these folks, these county election officials, just want to do a good job. You wouldn't even know their partisan affiliation in talking to them. And one of the things, and I'll kind of call them out a little bit, it was a little pulling teeth to be up here because the fear is that you come across one way or another. And these officials across the country, especially in Texas, need the freedom to be the experts that they are in their field, right? So we implore the Secretary of State, we implore the legislature to trust them as the subject matter experts because they really are the ones not only on the front lines, but the ones that know how it operates in Bastrop versus Wilco versus Llano versus Travis. And having trust in your local county election officials will go a long way in securing the trust, I think, of voters across the country. So I appreciate you guys. Thank you for your time and everything. And